Church buildings attract people and show how this congregation is different from and superior to other congregations. I can remember when people put up air conditioning signs. Yep. The emphasis on buildings and the amount of money congregations raise for and invest in them are so great that in the United States, the word church is first and foremost a building. Church is the place where one goes or where others go to church. Only secondarily is the church a body of people that gathers for worship and fellowship, and despite theologians and ministers' best efforts, the word church rarely means something beyond the congregation, such as a synod, denomination, or the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Preachers and leaders need to recognize and accept congregations' deep attachment to their buildings. Then they might better approach the physical plant as a tool for, rather than an obstacle to mission. Does that make sense? Yeah. The space where people worship forms and reflects people in ways more influential than what the preacher says in a sermon. For example, when people can see each other, the community becomes different than when people are sitting and looking at each other's backs. Right? So the building wins. So how can preachers enlist the building's help in getting the people out of the building? Rather than dismissing the church building, giving it a voice in preaching, as a beloved member of the congregation and a partner in mission, can help preacher and people consider together what the space indicates about the congregation's priorities, practices, and participation. So how can your worship space, how can you point to that as a way of providing incentive, motivation, theology for getting people out of the space? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So it means spending time in the space going, how can I use this space? So the space stops being an enemy, if you will. Yep. Can the building provide a lens that helps us to see Jesus in the neighborhood? So I love to talk about all of us kneeling at the rail, right? And say, this is God's image for feeding the world. And where do we see that in our neighborhood? When we see the food pantry, that's like us at communion. Jesus is feeding the food. Right? And can we change the building from our home to a community center? One way to do that is to lose the word membership, except when you have to. Just people become part of the community, but they don't want to be members. So my dad died, and we went to church for the funeral, and there were more people than we thought. And I'm standing with one of our neighbors, who I didn't really know well, because that's one of my mother's neighbors, who I didn't know well. And of course, because I'm a pastor and a professor, people are walking up to me going, Craig, we need more chairs. Like, yeah, good. Well, we need more chairs. And so my neighbor says, well, I know what the chairs are. Should I go get the chairs? And I'm like, yeah. So he comes out with the thing, the little wheelie thing of chairs. And we start setting up chairs. So I say to my mom, is he from the church here? And she's like, no. So I'm like, so how'd you know where the chairs are? He said, well, this is my church. I said, oh, really? Yeah, this is my church. I said, do you worship here? My mom's never seen you worship. Oh, no, I don't come on Sundays. I come to Narcotics Anonymous on Wednesdays.
Oh, nice.
That's my church.
Nice.
Yep.
How do we change that? The second thing we need to do as leaders is to get out of the building as part of sermon preparation.
Yeah.
Get out of the building as part of... You can do all your research with the books and all that stuff that I insist you do. And then you do an incubation period where you need to think about get out of the building. Or pack up a book bag and go somewhere. And when I say get out of the building, and I mean this now when I talk as a bishop, when I say get out of the building, I don't mean into the world of Facebook. You know what I mean? Oh, I'm going to leave the building and go talk to the ELCA clergy group and ask them what they think my sermon is about. No! Get out into the neighborhood and do some of your sermon preparation there. Prepare in a public place. What would it mean to do, I don't have Starbucks here, I found out. But Brad, what would it mean to do sermon preparation at Starbucks or in Michigan at the beach? Or, any places where people gather. What would it mean to do that? Sermon preparation there, okay? Do it in a public place, so the voices are no longer the people in your church. They're there because you love them, but guess who else gets a voice? The people in the neighborhood. Yep. Visit the context of the readings. So you need to notice the context of the readings, and if you can, go there. So the laborers, and he comes in the morning, at noon, at night. You know what I mean? Yeah. I would like to do that on a cherry farm in Michigan. I would like to just do that. So a few years ago, I was in Lodi, California, and I was visiting a church, and they do wine there, so they took me to a winery, a small winery, and I met the vintner who's a member of the church, and he's showing me how, how you make wine, and it's all very scientific, and then we got to go to the cask room and drink for hours. It was great. So I'm there's lots of Bible stories in the about winemaking. How would this help me understand them? Oh, I am not a theologian. I am a winemaker. I do not know anything about Scripture. Yeah, well, tell me. So I read a couple of things. Oh, well, the truth of the matter is, winemaking is all grace. It's all grace. You just told me all the science. Yeah, but in the end, God gives the grapes. He did this beautiful treatise on grace. I won't hear those texts again. We need to get out of the office and go talk to people who get this stuff. So do sermon preparation. Go where the context is. And do some sermon preparation. At Notre Dame, I just teach at Notre Dame, and at Notre Dame, our preaching students took 4 semesters preaching. And they all listened, everyone listened attentively, it was great. And then they got to their parishes, and they were stunned. They called the professor and I up and said, people don't pay attention. So we would take them out on campus, and we would take them to a location and say, you have 5 minutes, find the text, and preach a sermon appropriate to this location. It was great fun. So, we put one kid on father. Now he's father. We put him on the steps of the Golden Dome, and he got stuck, so we gave him the text. See these great stones, not one stone will be left without another. Preaching out of the Golden Dome was pretty fun. Changing where you study will inform the context, will change your preaching. Get out of your building as part of sermon preparation. Right? Log encounters with Jesus and then share it. Log encounters with Jesus and then share it. We're really good at preaching Lent. We can point to the brokenness of the world very well. And then we get to Easter in the 7 weeks and get immediately vague and theological and black and white rather than color. So I think a good Lenten discipline is spend Lent logging encounters with the risen Christ so that you have something to preach at Easter. Out in the neighborhood, where do you encounter Jesus? Keep a log and work it into the sermons. And And pretty soon you might be able to ask people where they encountered Jesus this week. Right? We need to speak about Jesus. If we want to get people out of the building, we need to speak about Jesus. I used to think that if we can get people to come to church, they might come to know Jesus. Now I'm convinced that if we can help people come to know Jesus, they might come to church. Right? So our goal is not to preach the glory of St. John's Lutheran Church, but to speak of Jesus. We need to preach Jesus, not church. Ask many Christians about Jesus, and they tell you about their church. They tell you how much they love their church. They tell you about how much the church is their family. They will tell you about their pastor, about how great or cool their pastor is. Except the question was about Jesus. So we need to speak about Jesus. Speaking of Jesus leads us out of church, or at least the church building. Speaking of Jesus leads us to get out into the community, not to take Jesus there, but because that's where Jesus is.
Amen.
I'm not saying Jesus is not in church, right? But Jesus is not only in church. And Jesus is not hanging around an empty church. Right? Speaking of Jesus, preaching, and when we speak of Jesus, we as preachers serve as language teachers who offer the vocabulary of Christian tradition to their congregations to use to shape, define, and create reality, that is, to make meaning of God, self, and the world. The real power of the pulpit, then, lies in the extended process of modeling how to use the vocabulary of the Christian faith so that the traditional language of ancient Christianity and Christian communities truly becomes the language of the 21st century. So we're not even going to proclaim Christ, but in the way we proclaim Christ, we are modeling people how to speak of Jesus. So we need to prepare sermons in the awareness that we are modeling for people how to speak of Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yep.
The book you want is The Homiletic of All Believers by O. Wesley Allen, A-L-L-E-N. So as you write your sermons, how would it be helpful for people to speak of Jesus and pick a place in your neighborhood, your community? And that will change your language. We need to preach. So we doing okay? Yeah. So the last thing we need to do is we're going to learn to preach sanctification. We need to learn to preach sanctification. Early Christians concentrated on developing a practice that contributed to a habitus, a system of embodied dispositions that organize the ways individuals perceive the world around them and react to it. The early church developed a habitus for both individual Christians and Christian communities. So there was a way of being Christian. There was a way of being a Christian community. Early Christians believed that when the habitus was healthy, the churches would grow. So what is the habitus of your congregation? Worship, fellowship, service, prayer, Bible study, almsgiving. What is the habitus of your community? Well, we don't really like Bible study. And, we send some money to World Hunger. And, we're kind of all retired, so, we're in worship when we can be here. How come we're not growing? Right? What is the habitus of your congregation? The early church's theology as they developed their habitus was unhurried. A theology of patience, as I said. Changing a habitus is going to take time. Developing a habitus is going to take time. That means two things. That means that the quick turnaround that many congregations want to need probably is not going to happen. Right? So then you got to change the conversation from how we got to grow to here's the deal, folks. This is what we need to survive. And that's not a Christian message. That's this is what we need to survive. Right? My wife speaks of our offering and our dues. We do pay some dues and then we do the offering too. Right? She's right. So we need to change the conversation. It also means that we need to develop patience in us, or at least I do. Because I want to see results, right? So I need to develop patience in us, and it probably also means, at least I tell my pastors this, it's probably not going to be 3 and out. Because the third year, you're probably just getting started. So it is characteristic of the early church's approach that the carriers and the embodiers of the church's growth were marginal, humble, and often anonymous. They were women as well as men, individuals as well as communities. I believe that like in the early church, in this church's life, coming to church, coming to faith will be relational, and we who dress like this probably won't get to do a lot of that. I mean, all I talk to, I don't like you, Jim, all I talk to is church people.
Yeah, that's true.
So I'm not going to bring anybody to Jesus because all I talk to is church people. And when I'm around non-church people anymore, I don't want to talk church. In the early church, what outsiders saw and what outsiders see today is not so much our preaching, but our behavior, our way of being in the world. According to Tertullian, the outsiders looked at the Christians and saw them energetically feeding poor people and bearing